Well, greetings from the United States. My name is Dr. Scott Adams, and it is my distinct honor to be with you. And it is my honor to present to you my work titled Ethical and Missional Prayer for the Church and the World, a Johannine Perspective. The content of this presentation largely consists of materials from the second chapter of my recently published book titled In Jesus' Name, Johannine Prayer in Ethical, Missional, and Eschatological Perspective. Due to time constraints, I will devote my attention narrowly to the ethical and missional aspects of prayer from the farewell discourse in particular. I will conclude by offering remarks concerning the implications of this topic for the church at large. Now, as we begin, it is often pointed out that the fourth gospel lacks the sort of moral teachings that are located within other New Testament documents. For example, there are no instructions concerning forgiveness, divorce, restitution, or how to handle sinful offenses. There is no Sermon on the Mount or other ethical instructions such as those located in the Pauline literature. Scholars suggest that while some ethical principles can be established from the Johannine Christological profile, the reader is left with no explicit ethical directions or imperatives. However, others have sought to identify and elucidate the presence of implicit ethics within the Johannine literature. For example, a notable amount of discussion has centered on Jesus' love commandment as it is expressed in John chapter 13, verse 34. Namely, and here Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." In this instance, Jesus provides a straightforward commandment that, in turn, has implications for believers and unbelievers alike. In recent times, Christopher Skinner has successfully demonstrated the universality of John's love command as it is expressed in the farewell discourse. And he has done so by tracing the trajectory of love that begins with one another, moves toward friends, and then culminates in Jesus' prayer for all believers in chapter 17. Skinner notes that the foot washing episode is, and I quote, "a symbolic act," end quote, that, and I quote, "anticipates Jesus' ultimate act of sacrificial self-giving, his death on behalf of the world," end quote. In washing the disciples' feet, Jesus provides an example, hupodeigma, that firmly elucidates the nature of his love for his disciples and exemplifies the sort of love that his disciples are to display toward one another. However, in this paradigm, Johannine love also contains missional implications, as Skinner points out. The aim is for the love within the believing community to capture the attention of the unbelieving world so that it will be drawn into the sphere of God's saving love through Jesus Christ. And once again, I invite you to look at Skinner's work for more information about this very topic. Further, Michael Gorman says that John's gospel, and I quote, "possesses an implicit love ethic, not merely of love toward outsiders generally, but of enemy love," end quote. Gorman grounds this ethic in the incarnation of the Logos who became flesh in a hostile world in order to draw people into the loving union of the Father and the Son. Thus, while these scholars have convincingly argued for a love-based ethic that has implications for believers and unbelievers alike, my presentation will explore how this ethic relates to prayer within the context and interests of the farewell discourse in particular. And so let's turn there now. As one looks at the farewell discourse, the reader will quickly pick up on the fact that the disciples find themselves situated in what may be appropriately labeled an eschatological crisis. Jesus' departure is close at hand. The disciples' hearts are troubled. And, well, it seems as though Jesus' mission appears to be incomplete. However, the solution to this apparent crisis involves, at least in part, faithful disciples who offer ethical prayer for the honor of Jesus' name and for the glory of the Father. Jesus says in John chapter 14, verses 12 through 14, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do, because I'm going to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, this I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it." Now, for emphasis' sake, we're told that Johannine prayer is offered in Jesus' name. I've explored the meaning and essence of Jesus' name elsewhere, but suffice it to say, the fourth gospel presents Jesus as the Logos, who came from God as God, and as the one who laid down his life for his disciples, and the one who gave up his life for the salvation of the world. Thus, it is reasonable to suggest that Jesus' name is associated with his loving example and God's saving mission in a hostile world. But there's more to this discussion than what most scholars have identified. In light of Jesus' divine self-identification and the very nature of his name, prayer in Jesus' name is associated with prayer in Yahweh's name. Since God has given his name to Jesus, and Jesus is Yahweh's saving envoy to the world, then it is reasonable to suggest that praying in Jesus' name is analogous to taking up God's name and assuming the responsibilities thereof. The seriousness of such a task is recalled in the third commandment, Exodus 20, verse 7, which states the following: "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." In the most basic sense, God's name, Yahweh, stands for his nature, essence, and corresponding matchless value. And Douglas Stewart is right in saying that the third commandment is, and I quote, "worded generally enough to encompass any misuse of Yahweh's name," end quote. With this background in mind, scholars have provided a number of possible suggestions concerning the relationship between the Decalogue and the commandments in the fourth gospel. For example, J. Kanagaraj sees Jesus' words, "keep my commandments," in here with reference to John chapter 14, verse 15, as providing a key for understanding the implied ethics of the fourth gospel. He asserts that the evangelist reflects on the Decalogue and reinterprets it through the person and work of Jesus. In his view, the Decalogue may in fact serve as the backdrop to the love command in the farewell discourse. Jan van der Vaart suggests that, and I quote, "the full scope of the moral situation envisaged by the Decalogue is indeed present and addressed, except for the 10th commandment, which is not explicitly dealt with," end quote. For example, the Jews accused Jesus of blasphemy in John chapter 10, verse 33, which relates to the honor of God as indicated in the first and third commandments. The topic of the Sabbath, which appears in John 5, 7, etc., is a notable issue in the gospel and coincides with the fourth commandment, as van der Vaart points out. Although the third commandment is not explicitly repeated in the fourth gospel, the intent of the commandment is exemplified in the life and ministry of Jesus, who showed esteem for the one who issued the commandments, namely Yahweh. For example, Jesus comes in his Father's name and performs works in that same name. Carmen Imes notes, and I quote, "Jesus' prayer, 'Hallowed be your name,' is not just wishful thinking, as though Jesus is hoping that Yahweh is doing well up there. His prayer implies a personal commitment to honoring that name through a life of faithful obedience. He fulfills Israel's vocation to bear Yahweh's name with honor," end quote. She says further, and I quote, "The name of God is not a charm to be used at will. Those who fail to carry out God's will bear his name in vain," end quote. This being the case, Jesus' name must be utilized in a manner that coheres with the intent of the third commandment. Therefore, Jesus' name should never be used to coerce God or offered in a flippant, irreverent manner. It should never be employed for selfish gain or self-seeking purposes. It should be honored, esteemed, and always employed in an ethical manner that coheres with his nature and mission. It should not be offered solely for the benefit of the worshiper, but for the glory of God and the advancement of his cause. In this understanding, Johannine Prayer is ethical insofar as it seeks to show proper reverence for the giver of the law and the one to whom it points. Moreover, it is plausible to suggest that prayer in Jesus' name might naturally be viewed as prayer that imitates his loving example as set forth in the foot-washing episode and, ultimately, in his cross death for the sake of the world. In particular, the foundation of the disciples' communal and soteriological praxis is a love-based example that provides the content and contours of their prayers. This sort of prayer is ethical because it not only seeks for the welfare of the believing community, but also longs for the salvation of the world as greater works are performed in Jesus' name, and the mission of God is carried forth through the community. It is offered by the disciples within the believing community, but it also seeks for others to be drawn into relationship with the Father through the Son. As new members are added to the family of God, they necessarily assume a new identity, and their ethical choices must reflect this identity. Therefore, the children of God must live according to the ethical value system of their Father. While the evangelist does not enunciate the exact content of prayer in the farewell discourse, the emphasis placed upon the Father's glory requires that it conforms to the family values established by the Father and modeled by Jesus' loving example. Prayer for other purposes is a betrayal of the ethical standards of the family. As such, disciples should never offer petitions based on motivations that are incongruent with or antithetical to the will of God as expressed through Jesus. Now, with this in mind, let's turn to John chapter 15 and look briefly at Jesus' words concerning prayer in verses 7 and 8. Here Jesus remarks, "If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples." At first glance, Jesus called for the disciples to abide in him, and for his words to abide in them may have little to do with ethics. However, the evangelist indicates that all that Jesus says and does flows from his union with and education from the Father, as Vandervat points out. From this union, Jesus speaks only what he hears from the Father. Thus, if it can be maintained that Jesus' words include all that he spoke during his ministry, and if all that Jesus spoke was true and in obedience to the will of his Father, who is, according to Vandervat, the, and I quote, sole determiner of right and wrong, end quote, then by extension, the sum total of his words provides a Christological profile with ethical implications. As seen in John 13:13, Jesus, the disciples' teacher, provides ethical education to his disciples by his actions in particular. And then Jesus goes on to iterate the necessity of replicating that education in their love for one another. Jesus says in John 15, verses 12 and 13, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends." As the disciples are obedient to the education they received, they confirm their status as Jesus' friends and receive further insight or revelation on the basis of this friendship. When Jesus' words are received and adhered to, they inevitably have a transforming effect on the ethical value system of the believer in general and on his or her prayers in particular. But prayer, according to Jesus' words and example, aims for the glory of the Father. Also, by necessity, seeks for the welfare of the family of God and its numerical growth. It values truth over falsehood and is offered for the well-being of others in the community. It promotes honor over dishonor, life over death, and contentment over covetousness. It seeks for the well-being of insiders within the family of God, but also longs for outsiders to be drawn into relationship with the true God of Israel through Jesus. Thus, as the disciples are faithful to Jesus and pray according to his indwelling words, his loving character and values are replicated through them as they love one another and produce more and more disciples who in turn do the same. As fruit is produced, the ethical values from above are displayed within the Johannine community below, and God's saving mission is carried forth. And here I argue that fruit involves ethical fruit and missional fruit. However, Richard Hayes is right to remark, and I quote, "Even though their primary mandate is to manifest love and service within the community, The disciples who share Jesus' mission in the world can hardly remain indifferent to those outside the community of faith, end quote. From the standpoint of the farewell discourse, prayer in Jesus' name and on the basis of his words and commandments serves as one of the means by which group members take responsibility for the community they participate in and for the world they seek to reach. Now, up to this point, the focus of my presentation has centered on the nature of the disciples' prayer to Jesus. However, there is a bit more to say concerning the ethical implications of Jesus' prayer to the Father in John chapter 17. However, due to time constraints, we cannot look at that now, but if you're interested in this topic, you can pick up a copy of my book and read further. But so far, I have provided my conclusions from the biblical text. But as we begin to conclude, I would like to offer three implications for believers in the contemporary church. And I would like to begin with my first implication, which reads as follows. First, our prayers are ethical when they are offered from a faithful relationship with Jesus. In practical terms, we must be careful not to use Jesus' name unless we are willing to submit to his name. We must remember that Jesus is not a genie in a bottle, but the risen Lord of heaven and earth. As such, as we honor the Father and the Son with our lives, we can rest assured that the prayers from our lips are authentic and congruent with the faith we proclaim. Second, our prayers are ethical when they extend beyond our personal interests to the interests of the believing community. All too often, Christian prayer is myopic, self-serving, and exclusionary. Of course, such prayer is not Christian at all. Of course, it is perfectly acceptable to pray for one's own personal needs, but prayer in Jesus' name necessarily bids us to seek for the welfare of those within God's family, the church. It has been said, if God answered our prayers, would it benefit anyone but us? This is a great question for us to wrestle with. Third, and finally, our prayers are ethical when they are missional in focus and aim for the numerical growth of the family of God. By its very definition, prayer in Jesus' name demands that requests be made for those beyond our immediate circles of Christian concern, for communities and peoples and nations beyond our own, for those who aren't like us, and even for those who hate us and the Jesus that we've placed in. This sort of prayer is offered in hopes that the enemies of the cross will be drawn by the Father to salvation through the Son, so that they too might become members, children of the family of God. This sort of prayer cries out, as the Moravian missionaries did, that the lamb that was slain would receive the reward of his suffering. And his reward includes people from every nation, tribe, and tongue. This is the sort of prayer the evangelist might have offered in his own day. And of course, he would have done so in Jesus' name. Well, this concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to receiving some questions from you.